My name is Randy Cross, and I'm in the English department at Calhoun Community College in Decatur, Alabama. We are here today in the beautiful Princess Theater in Decatur with our 14th annual Writers Conference, and I am pleased to introduce our guest for this year's conference, poet Billy Collins. Welcome, Mr. Collins.
Great. Thanks. It's good to be here.
Good. We're glad to have you. And I know that you, over the past few years, have done a lot of traveling, a lot of speaking, television appearances, as well as readings at colleges and literary festivals. And you've been quite successful at it. But surely somewhere in all of those travels, there must have been an unfortunate event you could tell us about, a reading that didn't go exactly as you had planned.
Do you mean like a Lemony Snicket kind of version of my life? I don't know. I mean, they all, it's not so much the readings go well. It's getting there. You know, it's getting there and back. It's the, you know, I was telling someone that I don't collect anything like little raccoons or elephants or something like that, but I collect room keys, plastic room keys, and I probably have a stack if you could stack them. You know, if they would stay stacked, it would be, you know, as high as a small child. So, and those represent basically lonely nights and.
But you don't plan to go back and use them again?
No, well, no, they're coded temporarily for people like you who would try to go back. But one thing that does happen in terms of travel disorientation, if I'm going from one hotel to the other, it's hard to keep track of the room number. So I might go to the room that I was in last night, 302 or something, and the key doesn't work, and then that's as best as I can do, really.
So, has there ever been an audience that didn't react the way you thought the audience should react to your work?
I've had underreactions. I mean, I was at a school called, well, you might as well, it's St. Sebastian School. It's a Catholic boys' school outside of Boston, a prep school. And I knew something was wrong when, you know, St. Sebastian was the one who was martyred by being shot with lots of arrows. I think the real story is he survived that and died of a heart attack later or something. But anyway, in the Christian iconography, he's the saint that's like has porcupine quills of arrows in him. So as we're walking, I'm being escorted by a student over to the building where I'm about to read, which turns out to be a chapel. I see the scoreboard of this empty playing field. And the scoreboard, it says guest on one side, and then it says arrows on the other side. And I stopped and I said, do you mean to tell me that you're called the St. Sebastian Arrows? And, you know, that, inappropriate's not the word, I'm not sure what it is, but I said, you know, if you were like the St. Joan of Arc school, would you be the Flames? You know? And you could go on from there, you know? But the trouble with that was, it was I was introduced very seriously, and all the boys were in there. It reminded me of my days in Catholic high school. You know, jackets and ties, and they didn't laugh at anything. So it's very disquieting to have a completely silent. I mean, there are two kinds of silences, or maybe many kinds of silences, but there's a good and a bad silence in a public reading or a public address. And a good silence indicates there's been a kind of intensification of feeling or whatever. And then the bad silence is just dead air. And there was mostly dead air.
Well, speaking of audiences, I know that you have spoken at the White House and given a reading. Could you tell us how that came about? Most of our viewers, most of us don't ever get to speak at the White House. So what was that like? Well,
there was one occasion where it was President Obama and his wife had a kind of evening of entertainment, they had a cabaret set up in the White House with little tables. And then they had a number of performers. One was Steve Martin was there playing his banjo, and there was a rapper named Common who was there, and somehow me. And so we all just got up and did our performance. It was the moment that was very touching was there was one of the rooms had been turned into a kind of green room where the performers were just hanging out waiting to come on stage, and the president and the first lady walked in, and they were waiting to go on stage, or they were being introduced by someone, and Michelle was standing in the back of the president. She put her arms around him, you know, and it was just such a touching private moment. You see these people are in such public view, and you could just see the affection there. That was a very revealing experience. But it was fun to, you know, to play in front of the First Lady and the President.
Well, I know it must have been an honor for you as well, of course, to be named the United States Poet Laureate, not once, but twice. Could you tell us something about how you learned about that appointment and what that entails, and what does it mean to be the United States Poet Laureate?
Right. Well, it's a great honor, of course. It makes a lot of other poets unhappy, and which is the point of writing, is to make other writers unhappy. And I felt well, I never dreamed of that, as they say, you know, and I have a pretty rich fantasy life based on self-aggrandizing scenarios. There I am playing jazz piano in some nightclub, and the guy who used to date my girlfriend was there, you know, feeling smaller and smaller. I mean, this is stuff I think about almost constantly. But I'd never even fantasized about this. And so when the call came, and it was a call from the Librarian of Congress, and that's who appoints he, and I say he because we've never had a female Librarian of Congress. He is charged by Congress to keep that office filled, so he has to find a poet laureate and keep and appoint them. So he basically calls you up. It was a phone call, and I got off the phone. I was kind of dizzy with the fact that this had happened, but at the same time, I had no idea what that meant. And I thought, well, now what do I do? Do I speak to people differently, or can I wear the same clothes? You know, that kind of, do I get from place to place in a different fashion? Well, you know, those questions were, but it's a very vague job description, and that's the kind of job I adapt to very well. The poet laureate has to give a reading and a lecture at the library for every term. And the other thing has to be a lecture, not a reading. And that's about it. You know, you get $25,000 to give to a couple of younger poets, and excuse me, and you get a stipend. The stipend is, I think, $35,000 or $37,000, but it's been the same since the 1950s. So $37,000 in the 1950s, you could move to Washington and, you know, ensconce yourself in a townhouse and all that. But that's not enough money today to change your entire life. So I stayed in New York, but I would make frequent trips to Washington, usually every month. So there's not much to do. And there are poets laureate, and you learn that is the plural, poets laureate, who have done nothing. And some of them just don't feel like doing anything. They're not very outgoing. And some of them are somewhat elderly, and they're not expected to do much. I mean, Stanley Kunitz was appointed when he was in his mid to late 90s, I think, and it's more of an honorific. But if you have any ambitions, or if you have a sense that you could do something, you're quite welcome to do something. And I started the program called Poetry 180, which was a website with 180 poems that I thought were clear, contemporary, interesting poems that I encouraged high school students and teachers to read a poem every day. So there's roughly 180 days of the school year. If I were a Japanese poet, it would be called Poetry 236 or something, because they have more school days. Doesn't quite have the ring of Poetry 180. So there was a poem a day for American high schools, and the idea was teachers were told, don't discuss the poem, don't ask questions about the poem, just have the poem read, and as a supplement to the teaching of poetry. Because we find we encounter poetry almost always in a classroom environment. And if you imagine encountering music for the first time in a classroom environment, it would be very odd, especially if the teacher then started quizzing you about what the lyrics meant. So it was trying to get students to think of poetry as a part of everyday life. And that worked. I have a lot of good anecdotal feedback from high school teachers saying that even the most poetry-resistant student, eventually there'd be a poem that student kind of liked. And here's a student that doesn't like poetry, but he likes the thing that he just heard, which is a poem. Mm-hmm. So now he has a problem, right? He doesn't like poetry, but he likes that. So that's the kind of thing you're supposed to do with the minds of students. Create these kinds of problems where they have to figure that out. So anyway, so that worked very well. Now there are 2 anthologies, Poetry 180 and Poetry 180 More, or something like that. So that's my legacy. That's what I did when I was Poet Laureate. And I wrote the poem The Names, which was I read before Congress. That was fun, reading for the Obamas. Reading in front of Congress was quite another experience entirely. It says something about poetry, if I can talk about that for a second.
Sure.
Well, here is a joint session of Congress held in New York for I think the second time in history. The first time was when the British burned down the Capitol and they had to get out of town. So there they all are. I mean, all the faces one sees on television. And there were a number of speeches before mine, memorial speeches about 9/11 and what it meant for the country and kind of optimism for the future and that kind of thing. And then I was, Poet Laureate, I get up and I started reading the poem. And the poem starts the way a lot of poems start, with images. There's rain glazing the windows. It's a nocturnal scene, right? Well, I looked around at all the faces in Congress, and they were, many of them were cocking their heads like border collies, you know, like responding to a whistle or something. Like, what is that odd talk we're hearing? Because it pointed out not so much that the poem was good, but that poetic language is different from political rhetoric, right? And they were used to hearing, excuse me, a kind of recycled talk about terrorism and first responders and eulogizing the dead and stuff like that. And then, of course, they realized it was a poem, and then they divided into 2 groups. One group immediately lost interest, you know, because of they deployed the anti-poetry deflector shields that had been installed in high school. And another group paid attention. I would say a smaller group. But Pat Moynihan paid rapt attention. And whenever I was a little nervous, I would look at him. And so it was a very good lesson in how poetic language not only is different from public language, but public language doesn't prepare you. Prose or public language doesn't prepare you to be able to read poetry. They're such different media.
Well, it's certainly no secret that you have become the most popular poet in America. That must be a heady thing to contemplate. The most critically acclaimed poet in the United States. And if you will, just for a moment, if you think back to the 19th century, we had our 3 named romantic poets. We had Mr. Whitman came along, Miss Dickinson was there. Then the 20th century, Robert Frost, that's no poor company, and maybe Edwin Arlington Robinson and some others, but there wasn't a lot of humor in those poems. And then I think the history professors talk about the man and the moment. And maybe the moment was right for Billy Collins, who was able to introduce poetry, humor, into poignant and serious poetry.
Well, I agree. I'm lucky to have a pretty wide audience, but when you say I'm critically acclaimed, you're just not reading the right journals. I'm being critically trounced because I'm accused by a lot of people of being, I would say, under-conceptualized, right? Not rigorous enough, not requiring exegesis or interpretation. My response to those people is just, well, problematize it. I mean, that's what you're doing anyway. So, find a problem in there, and then you can have fun solving it. But I don't know. I don't know where this all happened. I detach from it. I don't believe it. I mean, Seamus Heaney said when they were talking about him being a poet, he says, well, I'm not a poet all the time. I'm a poet part of the day when I'm writing. And otherwise, I'm just someone who's going to go buy some shaving cream after our talk, and I'm not going to be a poet at that point. So the sense of, in fact, sometimes when I'm introduced, and the introducer is saying, he's won this award, and he's read at the White House, and he's published these books, I start thinking, who is this guy? Like, I can't wait to hear him read. And then I realize I have to get up and do it. So I think. If you buy into it, it's deadly for singers or poets or musicians. If you buy into your own publicity, it's a very dangerous thing. You can get lost in there, and so I don't believe it. I believe it, but I don't. It's not part of my sense of myself.
So you think it's the fact that you do inject humor into your work that sometimes critics take exception to, although Shakespeare was funny and Chaucer was funny and Mark Twain was funny.
Well, I figured out a way to, through reading other poets, I was given a permission slip. Influence is so important in any creative person's life, I think. One of the troubles with poetry is that it's too easy. The means of writing poetry are too accessible. That is to say, a pen, it costs $1.10 or something, and a piece of paper, and you can express yourself. Well, if you wanted to play the oboe, you couldn't just go up and grab the oboe and start expressing yourself. You'd take lessons. Or even oil painting. You'd have to figure out how to mix turpentine. And there's a lot of knowledge, right, to be in any creative art. If you wanted to, you wouldn't just attack a block of marble with a hammer, in order to make a statue of Queen Elizabeth or something. I don't know. You get these analogies, but you can. So there's no visible training to being a writer. The training is kind of invisible, and the training is reading. That's the training. Instead of practicing your scales and taking piano lessons or whatever, you have to read all these poets. You have to put in 10,000 hours as the common number for being proficient at something.
Well, speaking of reading other writers, I know a person you admire a great deal, Mr. Miller Williams, once said that the secret to writing is that you must improve upon the blank page. And could you talk about your experience with Miller Williams and maybe some other influential writers in your life?
Sure. You don't want to make the blank page worse. Is that it?
That's it.
It was better blank. Well, that's true. I mean, if you hear some terrible piano playing, silence was better than that, right?
Yes.
You've ruined silence. Right? You've displaced it. Well, let's see. Well, as I think Miller Williams published my first real book, and when he did that, I had submitted a manuscript to him. He sent the manuscript back, and he put a paperclip around a dozen or 15 or 17 of these poems. And he pointed out that these were good poems, and the others weren't as good. They didn't live up to the standard set by the little group with the paperclip. And he said, if you can write more poems that good, I'll publish your book. That was the most encouraging thing I'd ever heard, even though, 65% of the poems were junk. But I got rid of those poems, and I set out to I had these poems with the paperclip on my desk all the time, and I tried to write poems that were that good. And so in his absence, I actually didn't meet him until maybe 6 or 7 years after the book was published. In his absence, he was present as a teacher, as a mentor, because he pointed out what I could do, and it was extremely encouraging. And as I've told you before, the paperclip was equivalent to an MFA degree.
We've been talking today with United States Poet Laureate Billy Collins during our 14th Annual Writers Conference. And Mr. Collins, I want to thank you again for being with us. We appreciate your time so much.
Great to be here. Thank you.